today's flip lecture, we're going to talk about the Cold War after the Vietnam War, from 1974 to 1991. Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, and he's going to be the president that is going to engineer the end of the Vietnam War. But outside of the Vietnam War and a domestic scandal that would color his presidency, Richard Nixon presided over the period of the Cold War with the lowest tensions, known as Détente. And the word détente means the relaxation of tensions. And so when we talk about détente, we got to remember a few things. Nixon was a very fierce anti-communist. He participated in the McCarthy hearings, and he believed that the future of the world had to be a multipolar future, not just the US and USSR, but to include all the other countries of the world. And so because of this, Richard Nixon believed that the U.S. needed to build better relationships with their rivals in order to ensure peace and prosperity in the future. And Richard Nixon got his first opportunity in an unlikely place. In April of 1971, Communist China invited the United States national ping-pong team to visit their country. These will be the first Americans to visit China since the year 1949 and the Communist Revolution under Mao Zedong. And this was known as Ping-Pong Diplomacy because kind of this relaxation of tensions is going to begin kind of with something very small. But this is a signal, this invitation to the ping-pong team, that China wanted friendlier relationships with the United States. And so in response, Nixon reached out to China in order to advocate for a better diplomatic relationship. And so Richard Nixon becomes the first U.S. president to visit communist China. And so you might be asking yourself, why is Nixon the first? And part of this is that only the most anti-communist person with that reputation could go and negotiate and make agreements with the communists without looking weak, without looking like he is giving in to the other ideology. And so when Nixon goes to visit China, it's known as the opening of China to the West, because what this would do is it would create a U.S.-China relationship with few trade restrictions and other things that ultimately kind of we still enjoy to this day. And Nixon's visit to China also put pressure on the Soviet Union to meet with the United States representatives the way that China had. And so Richard Nixon very cleverly plays the two communist powers, China and Russia and the Soviet Union, against each other. And so here are some pictures of Richard Nixon's visit to China. And of course, in the United States, great parodies such as the Nixon-Mao ping-pong set are going to make light of this ping-pong diplomacy. But regardless of kind of the funny souvenirs, this represents one of the biggest advancements in Cold War diplomacy throughout the entire history of the Cold War. And responding to Nixon's visit to China and the new trade negotiations that Nixon was able to negotiate with Mao, in May of 1972, the Soviet Union invited Richard Nixon to visit the Soviet Union for a historic summit to talk about the proliferation, the creation of nuclear weapons. And so Nixon met with the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, who's going to replace Nikita Khrushchev. And they're going to sign a historic treaty called the SALT I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And what this agreement did is it limited the amount of nuclear weapons that each country was going to have and each country was going to build. Likewise, they're going to agree to increase trade between the United States and Soviet Union and exchange some scientific information between the two countries. The idea here is that the tensions are going to be the lowest of the entire Cold War because Americans and the communists are talking about their issues and making trade agreements rather than fighting proxy wars. So we talk about Richard Nixon's presidency, he probably accomplishes more in terms of foreign policy than any other president during the Cold War era. So here's a picture of Richard Nixon meeting with Leonid Brezhnev, who is on the left. And here's the signing of the SALT I Treaty, the first major treaty dealing with nuclear weapons. However, despite Richard Nixon's great successes in foreign policy, Richard Nixon is going to resign the presidency after being forced to leave office in 1974 due to a domestic scandal known as the Watergate scandal, which we will learn about a little bit later. And so in 1974, the vice president, Gerald Ford, was sworn in as the president, and he would have to deal with a series of new challenges to the New World Order that Richard Nixon tried to usher in. So even though détente is going to characterize Richard Nixon's foreign policy, kind of this relaxation of tensions with the major communist powers, there's going to be a lot of problems in the 70s that are going to be unrelated to that. The first is the OPEC embargo, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which was made up of a number of Arab states that controlled a large percentage of the world's oil. In 1973, these countries refused to ship petroleum to the United States because of the United States' continued support for the State of Israel. What this embargo did is it set off a national crisis of fuel shortages and high gas prices. Gas began to be rationed, and you were limited the amount of gallons of gas that you could buy. You were also limited to certain days in which you could purchase gas, and the gas prices began to get rapidly out of control during the 1970s. And Gerald Ford, for his part, is going to try to deal with these foreign policy problems in his own way. First off, he's going to pardon Richard Nixon, so that means that the country won't have to deal with a prosecution of a former president, but he has a lot of difficulty dealing with the economic repercussions of the OPEC embargo. Gerald Ford continued to kind of pick up where Richard Nixon left off in negotiating with the Soviets rather than kind of fighting proxy wars or threatening. But the Soviet Union is going to fail to live up to a lot of the agreements they had made with Richard Nixon during kind of the negotiations for the SALT I Treaty as well as others. And so because of the Soviets' failure to live up to some of these treaties, the American public is going to become less and less trusting of détente, and they'll believe less that the United States and Soviet Union actually can work together. And that feeling of distrust is going to kind of deepen with the presidency of Jimmy Carter, who was elected in 1976 as kind of a change from the Republican presidency of Richard Nixon. And Jimmy Carter is known as kind of an ethic moral crusader. When he's elected in 1976, he's not going to be willing to kind of look the other way with human rights violations and things like that in order to get deals done with the Soviets, the way that Richard Nixon was willing to. And so Carter's going to have a lot of difficulties in the world during his presidency. And the first is that the United States-Soviet relations are going to completely break down under Jimmy Carter. He's going to publicly criticize the Soviet Union for human rights violations and publicly criticize China. What this is going to do, however, is going to mean the end of détente, where the Soviets and China are not going to be willing to negotiate any sort of a treaty or have diplomatic relationships with the United States while Jimmy Carter is president. And to make matters worse, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded the country of Afghanistan. Jimmy Carter, in response, called for the U.S. boycott of the Olympics, and also he put a grain embargo on the Soviet Union in order to try to hurt them in terms of their economy. However, what all these actions meant was that the era of détente in the 1970s was all over. Carter in the Middle East, likewise. He's going to have some success, but also some difficulties. In terms of the Middle East, Jimmy Carter's great success was actually the Camp David Accords, which was a peace treaty signed between Israel and Egypt, historic enemies, in 1978. And Jimmy Carter is going to be the first president to really bring together the leadership of Israel and the leadership of the Arab states surrounding it in order to work out a plan for the peaceful existence of Israel in the region. But Jimmy Carter's presidency is going to be overshadowed by a crisis that happens in the country of Iran. And the Iran hostage crisis, which lasted for 444 days, is ultimately going to be one of Carter's major legacies. And a little background on the Iran hostage crisis. In 1979, there was a revolution staged in the country of Iran by various Islamic groups, and their goal was to overthrow the United States supported leader known as the Shah, who was kind of a monarch, and establish an Islamic republic under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini. Once the Shah was overthrown, the United States had given him refuge in the United States where he was receiving medical treatment. The new Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, demanded that the Shah be returned to Iran to stand trial for crimes that the new government said he committed while he was the leader. The United States refused, and so Iranian revolutionaries took over the United States Assembly and held 52 Americans hostage for over a year. all the rescue attempts failed, and in fact, one failed attempt is going to result in 8 U.S. soldiers dying in a helicopter crash. But every day that this crisis goes on, Jimmy Carter is going to look worse and worse, and America is going to look weaker and weaker. And so the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was Time's Man of the Year during the hostage crisis, is going to test Jimmy Carter. And Carter, for his part, is not going to back down to the Iranians, and he's not going to give in to any of these demands. However, his handling of the crisis, as well as the failed rescue attempts, are going to mean that Jimmy Carter's popularity is going to plummet, resulting in his loss in the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. But the Iran hostage crisis resolved on January 20th of 1981, just minutes after a new president, Ronald Reagan, was sworn into office. All of the hostages were released from Iran, and they were flown back to the United States. However, the Iran hostage crisis still has repercussions to this day, and the United States and Iran have had a very tense relationship ever since this crisis. And in 1979, the Soviet Union is going to invade Afghanistan in their own proxy war comparable to the United States' involvement in Vietnam. In 1979, there were many nationalist uprisings in Afghanistan against the communist government that was being propped up by the Soviet Union. Some of these soldiers were nationalists, some of them were Islamic jihadists, but they all kind of banded together under the flag of this group called the Mujahideen. They're going to be Islamic guerrillas, and they're going to fight against the Soviet invasion throughout the next decade. This war is going to last 10 years after the USSR is going to invade in order to try to make sure that the communist government of Afghanistan stayed in power. A lot of historians say this is the Soviet Union's Vietnam, as it is eventually going to drain the country of resources, and the casualties are going to be high, ultimately contributing to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. But these Mujahideen forces are going to declare themselves jihadists, believing they are fighting a holy war against the occupation of their land by the atheist invaders, the Soviet Union. One of the major leaders of the Mujahideen is going to be a young Saudi Arabian national known as Osama bin Laden, who is going to lead a guerrilla campaign against the Soviets with the help of the United States. This is the United States' proxy war, but it's one in which they do not put soldiers in. The CIA and U.S. military is going to give the Mujahideen all they need to fight, but they're not going to get directly involved. There's a picture of Osama bin Laden leading his Mujahideen soldiers throughout the Soviet-Afghan War. And in 1993, after the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States was very hopeful that the country of Afghanistan would become a peaceful republic inside of the Middle East. They would be wrong. But in 1980, a new president, Ronald Reagan, was elected, and he promised to directly confront the Soviet Union. When Ronald Reagan is elected, he's going to reject the policy of containment. His goal is not just to contain communism, his goal is to defeat the Soviet Union, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. He advocated a policy called peace through strength, which basically, in summary, means a massive buildup of the United States military, including advanced technology, including the Star Wars missile defense system. And he's going to spend $1.5 trillion on the U.S. military in order to try to force the Soviet Union into an arms race that they would not be able to afford. And so Reagan's strategy was by creating a new arms race in the 1980s to bankrupt the Soviet Union while they tried to keep up with America's massive government spending. However, the flip side of this is that it increased the government's deficit from $80 billion to $200 billion in a very short time. The second half of Reagan's foreign policy was the Reagan Doctrine, in which the United States pledged to support anti-communist rebels around the globe. However, this ends up becoming very controversial, as some of the groups that the United States backs during this era are not necessarily those that have America's same interest in human rights. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan are one example. in Nicaragua. The United States funded anti-socialist revolutionaries known as Contras, who were later cited with many kind of human rights violations. Also, the United States put soldiers into the country of Grenada in order to overthrow the socialist government there. And Reagan's foreign policy was also racked by a scandal called the Iran-Contra Affair, in which the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of some hostages during the Iran hostage crisis. And also, they sent money to the Contras in Nicaragua in order to fund their campaign against the socialist government there. The only problem with this is that U.S. law said it was illegal to sell weapons to Iran, and it was also illegal to continue to give money to these Contra revolutionaries. So all of this was done outside of the law through secret back channels, and though this scandal was never linked to President Reagan himself, it is going to hurt the respect of this administration among Americans in terms of foreign policy. But by 1985, the Cold War was beginning to come to an end. And a new head of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, began meeting with Reagan in order to kind of try to open up U.S.-Soviet negotiations again. But Ronald Reagan, again, his goal is to defeat the Soviet Union, and so he begins pushing the Soviets at every turn to change, including at a very famous speech at the Brandenburg Gate at the Berlin Wall, in which Ronald Reagan told Mr. Gorbachev, if you really seek peace and prosperity, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. A very famous phrase, but again, kind of highlighting Reagan's policy of the United States is going to push the Soviet Union to change. They are not simply going to negotiate with them. But the Cold War is going to end. Massive spending on the Afghan war as well as the arms race is going to create struggles in the Soviet Union. The economy is going to begin to tank in the 1980s as the Soviet Union is unable to keep up with the technological innovation and the economic boom experienced by the United States in the 1980s. And so two major reforms go into place in the Soviet Union. One is called perestroika, which is restructuring, which allows for some private businesses, and the idea of capitalism would now begin to take hold in the Soviet Union. There was also the idea of glasnost, which means openness, which means allowing freedom of religion, speech, political discussion, things that were illegal under kind of the very totalitarian Soviet regime. And in 1988, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, was elected, and he would oversee the end of the Cold War. In 1989, due to economic pressures as well as internal pressures by citizens wanting reform, peaceful revolutions began to replace communist governments in most of the Soviet Union's satellite states. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria are all going to change from being communist countries controlled by the Soviet Union to independent republics. And on November 9th of 1989, in a huge symbolic gesture, the Berlin Wall gates were open and the wall was torn down, symbolizing, for many people, the true end of the Cold War. In Russia, hardline communists tried a coup to overthrow the government, but it's going to fail, and ultimately the Communist Party will be outlawed in Russia, and the Soviet Union will be dead after all of these changes. But the world celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was the end of an era, and it was a watershed moment that represented the end of the Cold War. And finally, in December of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev announced the end of the Soviet Union and the creation of the Russian Federation, a democratic republic in the former Soviet Union. But even though the Cold War was over, challenges remained for the United States. There was a new world order, in which the United States would be the lone superpower, while the former Soviet countries would scramble to recover after the fall of communism in the East. The United States would have to answer, what should their role be? Also, what would the fallout be from all of these proxy wars, interventions, and the control of the world that the Soviet Union and the United States had engaged in? And then ultimately, what principles, what ideas, and what responsibilities would guide the U.S. foreign policy in the modern era? So the end of the Cold War was a watershed moment in which the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union that had dominated every aspect of life from 1945 to 1991 would be over. and Americans would now have to find their place in a new world.